Welcome back, everybody. So just a practical detail, we're now in session 4, and there will be a slight change in the order of the talks. So we're going to start with Meghan Forbes, but then the second talk will be Roddy Hunter and Judith Bodor, and then it'll be Elizabeth Zimmerman and Augustina Andreoletti. And the reason for the change is just that there's a kind of nice logical and historical flow of ideas that we hope to benefit from. So our theme in this session is to really think about archive as artistic medium and put a strong focus on media themselves. So we're going to be extending our range to be thinking about radio, shadow libraries, thinking about magazines and so on. So I'm very pleased to be able to invite our first speaker, and I'm going to keep the introductions brief just to give us maximum conversation time. So Meghan Forbes is our first speaker, and she's here. That's great. Thank you. I got nervous. Meghan and I have not met. Hi, Meghan. That's terrible, isn't it? So Meghan is a postdoctoral fellow at the Met in the Museum of Modern Art Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and has deep expertise in really thinking about interwar forms of modernism with a Czech emphasis. But here today, you'll be thinking about underground print culture in East Germany. So Meghan, thank you very much.
Thanks, David. Thanks so much to the organizers for putting this all together. It's really an honor to be here. It's nice to see some familiar faces, meet some new people. As David briefly mentioned, I guess you could say my day job is working on the Czech interwar avant-garde, looking at their printed matter, namely periodicals and books, and how they circulated ideas through these publications. So this project that I'm presenting today is a bit of a pivot, and as such, as a work in progress, it's really exciting and a little bit nerve-wracking to share it with you. And in that sense as well, I'm really excited for hearing your feedback in the discussion to follow. Over the course of the last day and a half, I've been sort of adding and subtracting to my paper relative to the other talks. So hopefully I'll manage to keep to time. I do like to be pretty disciplined with regards to that. So let's dive in with this photo from 1986 issue of the East German magazine Anschlag. And we have here these painted rolos, which you can see in the background, or window shades that were a popular painting surface due to the fact that they were a cheap household good that could be easily stored and discreetly transported. We have this crowd in the large hall seemingly having their attention pulled in different direction, but we don't get to see at all what they're looking at, because instead the camera hones in on this couple in the middle who are looking fabulously punk and more interested in each other than anything else going on in the room. The photograph was taken by Karin Wieghorst, who was the subject of a recent retrospective at the Museum der Bildenden Künste in Leipzig, where the artist lives. And the photograph is both a compelling contribution to an alternative handmade magazine and a useful documentation of an important event in the history of underground art in the German Democratic Republic, or GDR. This event was Intermedia 1, a 2-day multimedial happening that took place in Kosvig on June 1st and 2nd of 1985. As we can learn in this advertisement that appeared in a different publication, also simply titled Intermedia, that doubly served as a catalog for the event after the fact, and after listening to Henao Rivier's presentation, it invites in perhaps a future-oriented framing of this document. So from this advertisement, we learned that there were 40 painted rolos installed in Kosvig for the event, and that the event also featured jazz, hard pop, dance, projections, and the like. At the back of the publication Intermedia, which was billed as a special issue of another magazine in Und so weiter, there's an envelope containing 17 black and white photographs of the installed rolos and a list of the artists who participated. So for instance, in one of these photographs, we have the artist identified as Andreas Hegewald of one of the rolos that appeared prominently in the Wieghorst photo I started with. The bound contents likewise comprise photos of the event's performers and audience members in action, including more images, for example, by Wiechorst. And then we have this photo by Volker Jager that gives a good sense of the size and venue of the crowd. And you can see here, again, more of these paintings displayed. The hodgepodge, DIY, and interdisciplinary approach of the underground art world has been commented on in the existing scholarship on the scene in East Germany, especially, for instance, by Christoph Tannert, and it is a common aspect reflected in the look and content of many of its publications. A single issue of one of these magazines might include, for instance, poetry, photographic documentation, advertisements, and exhibition reviews, some examples of which we've already seen, thus evidencing the place of these magazines and their creators both within this vibrant scene and also serving as primary documentation or a contained archival unit for anyone conducting research on it today. In this talk, I will posit the magazine, and in this case, the underground alternative magazines of the GDR, as an archive within an archive. And the idea of a magazine as archive is not particularly novel. We've already seen examples of it over the course of the last 2 days, for example, Ulysses Carrion's Ephemera. But I think it is a productive modality for thinking of these magazines. And for instance, I like the way that Nana Ariel has underscored her writing on, in her writing on one-time Hebrew Little magazines, in a volume, International Perspectives on Publishing Platforms, which I edited, in which she looks at the genealogy of the word magazine in relation to the Arabic term mazan, meaning, and this is a quote from her, a storage space, a small warehouse. If a magazine is defined by its function as a mazan, a storage space for various items, something that collects, summons, and presents, a magazine is in fact a little archive, end quote. So for this talk, I will consider both the space of the magazine as archive in conversation with the physical space in which it might hopefully come to be stored, and the essential role that the archive, library, museum, and similar such institutions play in the facilitation or obfuscation of a cultural history that printed matter helps construct. Over the last day and a half, we've heard about many different kinds of archives and different approaches to these archives, and indeed, there is a plurality of archives. We could think of a large and federally controlled holdings of a given government, and while that tends to be outside the field of purview of this conference, we have had sort of oblique reference to this kind of archive. For example, in Sven Speaker's discussion of Caroline Schleimer's intervention into her Stasi file. We could also think of an archive as that carefully kept catalog of items belonging to a single person, as we had an example of yesterday with Eva Pasek's archive, thanks to Karolina Majewska-Guda. Or we can think of it as something in between, as the case that Artpool models with grassroots origins that has come to find a level of institutional support. Here, I will also address how, where, and by whom the mini-archive of the magazine comes itself to be stored. That is, the people who do this work, the archivists, librarians, catalogers, and other staff, being an incredibly important and yet somehow so often overlooked agent in this knowledge production. The hero of today's story is precisely one such person, a librarian in Dresden who, we will learn, paved the way for the alternative magazines of the GDR, rare in their time and rare still now, to be safely preserved for the future. In what I can offer here, which is but a cursory introduction to a chosen few of the wonderfully unwieldy publications created in East Germany in the 1980s, I will engage a spatial reading of these magazines as material archives of an understudied art historical moment. These publications, fascinating objects in their own right, also comprise now a time capsule of the East German art scene as it was playing out, both in terms of photographic documentation of the sort with which I open this talk, as well as collaborative approach to collecting artwork and poetry to include in any given magazine. These publications, which were produced across a variety of cities in East Germany, including Berlin, Dresden, Halle, and Leipzig, are an in situ representation of their moment and locale. The energy of the GDR's final decade is thus captured in these underground periodicals, which incorporate a wide assortment of materials and employ diverse print methods, silkscreen and lithography, just being a few examples, also typewriting, and different binding methods, ranging from fine Japanese bindings to staples and brads. And they all operated outside of the larger field of state-supported art production and publishing houses in the GDR. So, to turn to our hero, the librarian Hildegard Sauer, she began to be able to collect these works, these magazines, in 1986 for the Saxon State and University Library, or SLUB, in Dresden. And she began collecting these alternative little magazines made by artists in the GDR, as she would later record in an issue of the library's newsletter in 1991. She also wrote more about their materiality in a newsletter article in 1990. She describes that although the magazines from the early 1980s appeared in tiny editions, or typically no more than 20 copies, and that they had little visibility, by the time she began to collect them, quote, the artists sought out attention. They sought out confrontation with a wider public and with the art critic, end quote. And indeed, in their moment of existence, they were already being exhibited and distributed through small galleries. Sauer underscored that these magazines operated independent of the censor, thanks to their underground and non-commercial nature, but likewise, quote, that in the cultural policy of the GDR, such an artist's exchange of material for publication outside state surveillance was not ordained, and thus was regarded as subversive. And she talks about how those with no access to publication within a state-sponsored press were inclined towards creating presses of their own. One example is the Leitwolf Verlag. Thus, these publications collectively represent one aspect of an art scene in East Germany that managed to exist outside of state-sponsored structures and remain, at the same time, relatively unhindered. The magazines fulfill a role as simultaneous art object and documentation of the art scene and aspects of daily life. And it's outside the scope of this paper to get into this here, but it also shows the dynamic participation of female artists in this milieu, which, with the exception of Susanna Altmann's exhibition, Radical Women Behind the Iron Curtain, has not really been reflected in a recent surge of writings and exhibitions related to art in the GDR. The earliest publications, such as Und Entwerte Oder, both published in 81 or 82, depending on the reference, and 1982 for Entwerte Oder, respectively, as well as later publications such as Und so weiter, which was an extension of Und, were essentially assemblings. Zana Gilbert, in her chapter on male art networks between Latin America and Europe for the volume that I edited, defines the assembled magazine as, quote, a publication for which artists send the entire run of their contribution to a coordinator, who is then responsible for its distribution. Often, assemblings were unbound, constituting a collection of objects to be handled rather than mere pages to be turned, end quote. As such, they demarcated a space to be collectively filled with contributions by various artists and writers, and their final form often reflected an accommodation of the contents therein. Universe is a notable example of this, and also something of an anomaly amongst the magazines mentioned here. It began in 1987 and continued after the fall of the Berlin Wall all the way into 1995. And it's based in Halle, and Sauer sort of identifies the magazines that are coming out of Halle as having being a special case of experimentation. As the galactic scope of its name suggests, Universe perhaps most fully represents a more international frame within which to consider the East German alternative publications. The editors for the earliest issues are Grigorio Burchenko, Ulrich Theuler, Georg Kowalski, and Guillermo Deisler. Deisler, who made his way to Halle from Chile via France and Bulgaria, was the main progenitor of the movement, and it is his address to which potential contributors were instructed to send their submissions. Active at the tail end of the movement, Universe fits within the Fluxus mail art networks of exchange between Latin America and Central Europe. Described as a portfolio, each issue features the work of approximately 40 artists. The unbound contents were typically packaged in carton casing with a collage cover that was then wrapped in twine, though there is some variation to this. For example, in the first issue, which almost looks like it was stuffed into a paper bag and then sealed with metal brads. Potential contributors to a particular issue were instructed to send 100 distinct copies of their work to Deisler for inclusion. Submissions typically came from Europe, but others hailed from Latin America, the United States, Australia, and Japan. And the full run of Universe is available in the MoMA library, which is where I had the opportunity to look at it. In issue 5, Gheorghe Galantai contributed a postcard to Universe in which he likewise sought contributions for Artpool. The postcard, which on the recto side includes a self-portrait of the artist on the verso, is self-addressed and a command is inscribed in red ink in English, please send me information about your activity. And last night when we had the chance to visit Artpool, I spotted a folder that said Universe along the side, and a different contribution was tucked into that folder, and we can see it on the poster in the back of the room, but in Artpool Out. So that was also printed in a smaller format and included in a different issue of Universe. So similar strategies such as this one abound in Universe and across the mail art network more broadly. As Gilbert describes, quote, assemblings became a key factor in constituting a network community, exemplifying the shift from the periodical as a site for the reproduction of texts to one in which artist and reader collaborated in the production of new texts and experiences. Publications of this sort were often the instigator of direct one-to-one content, since it was a primary way in which these new contexts could be found. And for instance, as a model of this, we have this rather enigmatic contribution, also from the same issue of Universe, a contribution of Zhao Mel Art that includes two addresses, both in the same hand. On one side, Serge Sergei in the USSR, and on the other side, Ryosuke Koen in Osaka, Japan. And he created the Brain Cell Mail Art Network in '85, which is then referenced on the cover of issue 6 of Universe, so the following issue of Universe. Once assembled and mailed out to participants, a successful issue of Universe would immediately experience atrophy, as participants might intervene into included artworks and send them back to their creators, as Galantai requests, or forward them on elsewhere in the larger mail art network. The active archiving principle, facilitated by practices associated with the mail art network, is thus a strong attribute of Universe, and at the same time, that archive was rendered intentionally unstable. Thank you. Though again, Universe is somewhat anomalous amongst the alternative magazines of the GDR in the 1980s, it would be hard to say what is standard, except maybe that variation was the norm. As already referenced, there are a significant number of publications that display a diverse and economical variety of materials, printing methods, and so forth that indicate what was on hand for artists at the time. So covers of Anschlag, for example, which is the magazine with which I open with a photograph by Karen Vikhorst, were variously made from sandpaper, vinyl, and here, even a grill corb for grilling fish. And another magazine, Der Schaden, likewise employs twine, glued-in film negatives, and this is common across many of the magazines, text typed on typewriters, which was sometimes Xeroxed and sometimes created, as in this case by Carolina Schleimer, with the use of carbon paper in Samizdat fashion, so wedging pieces of carbon paper between pieces of tissue paper to produce multiple copies at one time. So, to come back round to Vikhorst and her role as a key documentarian of the production of art in the GDR, at the back of the 14th and final issue of Schaden, a photograph of her by her presents the covers of issues 1 through 12 of that magazine. Thus, as a Bilddokumentation of the magazine, it creates an archival capsule of the magazine's production over the years. And today, the covers and full content of Schaden are further preserved thanks to a major digitization initiative of the Sloop with the Deutsche Fotothek. In fact, all the magazines shown and discussed here, with the exception of Universe, are publicly accessible online. a total of 24 alternative artist magazines in the library's collection have been digitized. Each scanned page can be viewed individually, along with metadata that credits the artist or author, provides information about medium, which is especially important in these magazines that employ so many different printing methods, dimensions, dates, and so forth. Clicking through this collection quickly provides the viewer with the sense of the diversity of materials used in creating these publications. But at the same time, it is no substitute for handling these items in person. The digital archive, to be sure, signals a democratization of access, but with the digitization and thereby activation of an archive by a wider body of viewers and researchers, there must be a concurrent impulse within archives, libraries, and museums to facilitate access to a wider range of material objects for more diverse publics, and concurrently, greater consideration on the part of researchers for the labor that goes into creating and maintaining these collections. At the SLUB, we do have a nice model for this. Sauer seems to have been a truly forward-thinking ambassador for the alternative magazines of the GDR, setting out to collect them for the library already in the 1980s. She put up together an exhibition of them in late 1991 to 1992 in the library, and then managed the digitization initiative with the Deutsche Fotothek in the late 1990s. Thus, while I have had the opportunity to view the magazines introduced here in person, in Dresden, and also to a lesser extent in Berlin, where the Kubi holds a smaller collection, and then, of course, as I mentioned, in New York, I was also able to continue my research and writing away from the collection thanks to this online catalog. But nothing compares to the excitement and discovery of handling these materials in person, touching the different papers, unfolding pages, and looking at their backsides. And indeed, there are barriers to access if one wants to look at these items in person in Dresden, which could be intimidating and prevent interested parties from making the effort. Apparently, restrictions to viewing these items have been in place essentially since the moment of their collection by the SLUB. As Sauer noted already in 1991, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, new problems emerged with regards to accessing these materials. She writes, quote, "The request for these examples of nonconformist work is now so great that these volumes, frequently produced from cheap materials, are seriously endangered. Frequent use of these very rare editions is thus not tenable from a conservation standpoint." End quote. The digitization of these rare volumes would seem to be in response to such real and legitimate concerns. But again, hopefully not at the cost of allowing physical access to an interested public, which might include, but ought certainly not be exclusive to, a scholarly and curatorial community. So far, with a bit of jumping through hoops, the magazines do continue to be accessible to view in person in Dresden or in Berlin or New York, and this is a welcome thing, as in order for these magazines to serve their function as archive, along with their preservation, responsible access to them is key. Thank you.